Good evening, and welcome to Pulse 60 News. I'm Emily Carter. Tonight, we're diving into a major story shaking up international trade. The United States has imposed a staggering 104% tariff on Chinese imports, effective as of midnight today, April 9th, 2025. China has swiftly retaliated, announcing an 84% tariff on U.S. goods, set to take effect tomorrow. To unpack this escalating trade war and its implications, I'm joined by Dr. James Harrington, Senior Economist at the Global Trade Institute. Dr. Harrington, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Emily. It's a critical moment in global economics, and I'm glad to provide some clarity.
Let's start with the basics. Can you explain what prompted this 104% tariff and how we got here?
Certainly. This tariff is the latest escalation in a trade policy championed by President Donald Trump, who returned to office emphasizing a protectionist agenda. The immediate trigger was China's refusal to retract its own 34% tariff on U.S. goods, which was imposed earlier this year in response to prior U.S. actions. President Trump issued an ultimatum last week, demanding China remove that tariff by April 8th or face an additional 50% increase on top of existing duties. China didn't comply, and the U.S. followed through, raising tariffs to 104% across a wide range of Chinese imports, everything from electronics to textiles. This builds on Trump's long-standing goal to reduce U.S. reliance on Chinese manufacturing and address what he calls an unfair trade imbalance.
That's a significant jump. What's China's response, and how does it fit into the broader tit-for-tat pattern we've seen?
China's response was immediate and proportional. Today, Beijing announced it will increase its tariffs on U.S. goods from 34% to 84% effective April 10th. This targets key American exports like agricultural products, soybeans, pork, and industrial goods. It's a classic retaliatory move in trade disputes designed to inflict economic pain on U.S. sectors that rely on Chinese markets. We've seen this pattern before, notably during the 2018-2019 trade war, but the scale now is unprecedented. Both sides are digging in, with China accusing the U.S. of economic bullying and pledging to fight to the end, while President Trump has hinted at further increases, potentially up to 125%, in a recent Truth Social post.
Let's talk about the scope. What exactly does a 104% tariff mean for the goods coming into the U.S. from China?
A 104% tariff effectively more than doubles the cost of importing Chinese goods. For example, if a shipment of consumer electronics, say smartphones, costs $100 million to produce and ship, importers now face an additional $104 million in duties. That cost is typically passed on to businesses and ultimately consumers. Given that China accounts for roughly 19% of U.S. imports, about $427 billion in 2024, this affects a massive volume of goods, clothing, toys, machinery, and more. Notably, 87% of Christmas goods sold in the U.S. last year came from China, so we're looking at a direct hit to retail just as the holiday season looms.
That's a sobering figure, especially with the holidays approaching. How are markets reacting to this escalation?
The markets are in turmoil, as you'd expect. Today, we saw sharp declines across major indices. Asian markets like the Nikkei and Shanghai Composite dropped 3 to 4%, reflecting China's economic weight in the region. European markets followed suit, down about 2.5%, partly because the EU is now entering the fray with its own retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, set for April 15th. In the U.S., the Dow and S&P 500 opened with volatility. Initial losses of 1.5% moderated slightly by midday, but investor confidence is shaky. This reflects uncertainty over inflation, supply chain disruptions, and the broader risk of a global economic slowdown.
You mentioned the EU. How does their involvement complicate things?
The European Union's decision to impose tariffs on U.S. goods, details of which are still emerging, adds a third front to this trade war. The EU is responding to U.S. tariffs that indirectly affect its own supply chains, as well as pressure from member states to protect their economies. Starting April 15th, we'll see duties on American exports like machinery and agricultural products. This creates a ripple effect. U.S. businesses face higher costs exporting to both China and Europe, while European consumers may see price hikes on goods tied to U.S.-China trade. It's a multilateral escalation that risks fragmenting global trade networks further.
Let's bring this home for our viewers. How will American consumers and businesses feel the impact?
For consumers, the most immediate effect will be higher prices. Goods reliant on Chinese components, think electronics, appliances, clothing, will cost more as importers pass on tariff expenses. Retailers are already warning of a 20–30% price increase on some items by summer if this persists. Small businesses, especially those dependent on affordable imports, may struggle to absorb these costs, potentially leading to layoffs or closures. On the flip side, US manufacturers might see a long-term boost if production shifts domestically, but that's a slow process, years, not months. For farmers, it's dire. China's 84% tariff slashes demand for US soybeans and pork, hitting rural economies hard.
Is there a silver lining here? Some argue this could strengthen US manufacturing.
There's potential, yes. The administration's goal is to incentivize companies to relocate production to the US or allied nations like Vietnam or Mexico. We've seen some evidence of this. About 7% of US firms shifted supply chains out of China between 2020 and 2024. Higher tariffs could accelerate that trend, creating jobs in domestic manufacturing over time. However, the transition is costly and complex. New factories don't appear overnight. In the short term, the pain of higher costs and market instability will likely outweigh any gains.
China's vowed to fight to the end. How sustainable is this standoff for both sides?
It's a test of economic endurance. China's economy is more export-driven. About 18% of its GDP comes from exports, with the US as a top market. A prolonged tariff war could shrink its manufacturing sector and slow growth, already strained at 4.5% last year. The US, meanwhile, relies less on exports, only 10% of GDP, but consumer spending drives 70% of our economy. If prices soar and confidence drops, we could tip into recession. Both have leverage. China with rare earth minerals and US debt holdings. The US with its market size and technological edge. Neither can win outright without significant collateral damage.
What about diplomatic efforts? Is there a path to de-escalation?
Diplomacy is possible but challenging. Trade talks stalled in 2023 and trust is low. The US could offer phased tariff reductions if China opens its markets further or cuts subsidies, issues at the heart of this dispute. China might counter with demands for tech export relaxations. The EU's involvement could force a broader WTO-mediated negotiation, but with Trump's skepticism of multilateral institutions, bilateral talks are more likely. Without a breakthrough, though, escalation seems the default.
Finally, Dr. Harrington, where do you see this trade war leading? What are the long-term consequences?
This could go several ways, Emily. In the best case, it pressures both sides to negotiate, leading to a rebalanced trade relationship, more domestic production in the US, fairer practices from China. More likely, however, we're headed for a prolonged economic standoff. Consequences could include a global recession if consumer demand falters and supply chains break down. We might see a fragmented world economy, blocs aligned with the US versus China, disrupting decades of globalization. Inflation could persist, eroding purchasing power, while industries like tech and agriculture face permanent shifts. The risk is a lose-lose scenario unless cooler heads prevail, which, given current rhetoric, seems optimistic.
A sobering outlook. Dr. James Harrington, thank you for your insights on this critical issue.
My pleasure, Emily. It's a pivotal moment and we'll be watching closely.
That's all for today.